Two men sit on opposite banks of the same river. They breathe the same air. One rises from his breath as if from a well, eyes open, the world newly lit. The other breathes and sinks, heavier with the same weight of day. Rumi's mentor, Shams of Tabriz, once asked questions that land like river stones. What is it that makes a breath wake a soul or silence it? We begin with that question because it is both simple and immense. The visible movement of lungs is the doorway to a subtler architecture. What if the laws that shape the cosmos also shape that small, intimate exchange of air? What if, read through an ancient lens, 7 principles are quietly arranging your days, your fears, and the way you love, all by shaping the rhythm and quality of your breathing? The claim in the title is straightforward, but demands careful unpacking. The 7 Hermetic principles are not dusty axioms meant for intellectual debate alone. Read through a Hermetic lens, they can be seen as descriptions of patterns that animate the body-mind. And breath, the most immediate and mutable of those patterns, is how much of that animation becomes felt and lived. Breath mediates between the seen and unseen, between habitual thought and spontaneous presence, between repression and revelation. In the pages that follow, we will treat the principles not as dogma, but as interpretive keys. Mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender. For each, I will offer a concise definition, a mapping to breath and somatic experience, a thread of scientific or Jungian support, and a practical implication you can feel for yourself. Before we go deeper, a quick note. If this way of reading Hermetic principles through breath, psychology, and lived experience resonates with you, subscribe to the channel. This is where we keep building these maps carefully, not as belief, but as something you can actually test in your own nervous system. Start with a simple map of the territory. Hermetic mentalism names the primacy of mind. The universe is, in this reading, an expression of consciousness or mind. Correspondence, as above, so below, tells us patterns repeat between scales. Vibration asserts that all things are in motion. Polarity names opposites as different degrees of the same thing. Rhythm points to cycles and tides. Cause and effect lays out a web of consequences. Gender names creative dynamics of active and receptive forces. None of these need to be taken as metaphysical absolutes. Treated as lenses, they reveal how breath both reflects and shapes the deeper grammar of our interior life. Mentalism, all is mind. That succinct phrase can sound abstract until you hold it against the literal fact that your breath alters your mental atmosphere every few seconds. To breathe is, in a very immediate sense, to think with the body. Inhale gathers attention. Exhale releases it. Viewed through the Hermetic principle of mentalism, breath becomes the operating system that mediates thought's tone and scale. The mind is not only a set of propositions, it is a living field embroidered with images, habits, memory traces, and affective tonality. Breath touches that field and shifts its contour. Imagine the inhale as a drawing in of the world. Attention narrows, neural networks synchronize, the foreground of consciousness brightens. The pause that follows, the small, often neglected rest between inhalation and exhalation, is where images either condense into identity or open into spaciousness. The exhale disperses. It is the texture of letting go or of resignation, depending on the habit it carries. Jungians would say these are somatic accompaniments of psychic movements. Complexes flare, archetypal motifs surface, the shadow's breath quickens when threatened by the light. Modern physiology adds that breath influences heart rate variability and vagal tone, the lines along which arousal and calm are negotiated. In plain terms, the way you breathe half determines the tone of your mind, not metaphysically but biologically and experientially. How does that look in practice? Consider a simple observation you can make any morning. When your inhale is shallow and rapid, your mind tends to tighten into worry. to rehearse threats. When your breath lengthens into a softer cycle, thought widens. Images lose their sharp edges and more possibilities appear. This is not a promise of permanent uplift. Practice matters, integration matters, but it is an empirically plausible mapping. Breath is one of the levers of mental tonality. Read through mentalism, breath is the operational interface. Change the breath and you change the mind's climate. A practical implication is modest and clear. Notice the breath before you follow thought. Let the breath be the gatekeeper, for when the gate is absent, thought rushes like uninvited guests. Notice this one. Inhale as mentalism. And if this is clarifying something you've lived but never quite named, take a moment to click the like button. It tells me this line of work is worth developing further. Correspondence, as above, so below. The ancients loved this line because it points to fractal repetition. Patterns at one scale mirror patterns elsewhere. Breath is the microcosmic oscillation that mirrors larger tides. If mentalism asks us to see mind as constitutive, correspondence invites us to notice how the micro-pattern of breathing indexes wider systemic states, the social, the seasonal, the cosmological. Take the four-stational mapping common in contemplative traditions. Inhale, pause, exhale, void, and watch it echo outward. The inhalation draws in the world. At the societal level, we call this accumulation or acquisition. The pause is a threshold. In collective terms, it is the space where law, ritual, or culture holds tension. The exhalation distributes what was taken in. The void is not empty nihilism, but a womb of receptivity, a field where new patterns gestate. In this way, a personal breath pattern can be a living index of cultural moods. In cities of glass and steel, the habitual breath tends to be compressed, clipped, zoned into performance. In a village or in the presence of a beloved, breath slows, widens, and the world is permitted to be softer. Physiology supports this correspondence. Respiratory rhythms coupled to brain oscillations. The tempo of breathing modulates autonomic balance, which in turn shapes perception, emotional reactivity, and social engagement. Neurobiologists studying respiratory sinus arrhythmia show how breath and heart co-regulate, and how those rhythms in turn shape attention and social resonance. From a Jungian perspective, bodily rhythms are not secondary to psyche, but expressive of its patterns. Dreams, synchronistic events, and somatic symptoms can be read as reflections of inner tensions. Correspondence simply asks, where does your breath echo elsewhere? If your breath is tight, where else is constriction present, in speech, in relation, in work? Practically, begin to map. When anxiety rises, pause and notice whether the breath pattern mirrors some outside tension, a message thread, a climatic season, a relationship dynamic. Naming the correspondence moves you from being overwhelmed by incoherence to being an observer of pattern. The breath here is both indicator and instrument. It shows the scale of change and offers a lever for it. To mark this distinction, write in the comments, "My breath mirrors my life." Vibration. Everything vibrates. That Hermetic axiom dissolves abstractly into poetry and concretely into measurable frequencies. Breath sets vibration into motion, the lungs, the vocal cords, the chest cavity, the bloodstream. Each becomes a field of oscillation. But vibration is not only mechanical, it is affective tone, timbral coloring of experience, the frequency at which a psyche hums. When you hum a single note and place your hand on your chest, you feel an internal resonance. The same is true of breath. The pattern and depth of breathing create a bioacoustic environment that the nervous system reads. Recent work on how vocalization and exhalation engage the vagus nerve demonstrates that sound and breath can modulate parasympathetic tone. Singing, chanting, and sustained exhalation alter autonomic rhythms in predictable ways. Stanislav Grof, wrote about how intense breathwork can produce experiences that are clinically comparable to certain non-ordinary states, rich symbolic material, regressions, catharses. I mention Groff not to endorse any wholesale therapeutic claim, but to anchor the observation. Breath can sculpt the vibratory field of consciousness. Read through the principle of vibration. Subtle shifts in breath are not mere quirks. They index different energetic qualities. A rapid staccato breath places you in a high-frequency nervous tone, alert, contracted, ready to act. A long, languid cycle moves you into lower frequency zones, digestion, integration, presence. The alchemical metaphor of solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, fits here. Breath can dissolve hardened patterns into pliancy when used to slow and ground. Breath can coagulate when it tightens and fixes a state into habit. This is why some spiritual practices caution about chasing high vibratory states without integration. Vibration without integration becomes mere experience collecting, an aestheticized avoidance of shadow. A practical implication is to attend to vibratory quality rather than chasing binary states of calm or peak. Notice the timbre of your breathing. Listen to its music. If you are preparing for a difficult conversation, adjusting the vibrational texture of your breath without gimmicks or guarantees changes the field of what you are likely to notice and how you will be received. A physiological fact that reads like poetry. Breath is not only air, but wave. When the wave shifts, the shore is rewritten. Polarity. Hermes taught that opposites are two extremes of the same thing. Cold and hot, love and hate, fullness and emptiness, they occupy the same axis. Breath contains polarity in its most immediate form. Inhale and exhale, expansion and contraction, presence and withdrawal. But the principle runs deeper. What we habitually construe as opposite states are often connected by a continuum. Think of the breath of anxiety and the breath of passion. On the surface they appear opposed, one defensive, the other vivifying, yet both can be high frequency, both can constrict the throat, harden the chest, and narrow perception. Conversely, what looks like apathy and what looks like equanimity may occupy different points on a similar scale. Both are low energy, but one is hollow and one is settled. This is the alchemist's craft, to discern gradations and to use that discernment to transform lead into gold, metaphorically, to take constriction and transmute it into intentional focus, to take excess and temper it into steadiness. Jung's work on the shadow is instructive here. The shadow often appears as the opposite of one's conscious self-concept. A person who prides themselves on generosity may find a hidden polarity in greed. The strength of one implies the existence of its counter. Breath becomes a method for meeting that polarity. As it opens and closes, it reveals the extremes and invites a middle way. Practices that cultivate subtle gradations of inhalation and exhalation can, when integrated, help the psyche recognize that opposites are degrees rather than immutable divides. Practical implication. When you notice an extreme in yourself, trace its breath signature. Is the chest high and rigid? Is the exhale truncated? Naming the polarity is the first step toward modulation. The Hermetic lens asks for delicate, patient work, not to abolish polarity, but to hold both poles and discover the balanced midpoint where genuine choice emerges. A physiological aside, the autonomic system itself is not simply sympathetic versus parasympathetic. It is a complex set of gradients and patterns. Breath practices that aim to flip a switch from fight to rest misunderstand the subtlety of the organism. The work is often one of refinement rather than radical alternation. We have now touched 4 of the 7 principles, each mapped onto breath in ways that begin to show their intimate, practical relevance. Mentalism reveals breath as an interface with mind. Correspondence teaches us to read breath as a microcosm of larger patterns. Vibration discloses the tonal textures breath weaves into our nervous system. Polarity invites us to trace the spectrums that breath both reveals and reshapes. The next principles, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender, will complete the Hermetic circle and deepen our sense of how these laws interlock to reshape life quietly. Before we continue, a necessary caution. Breath is a powerful tool. There are intense breathing methods, holotropic approaches, rebirthing, extended hyperventilative techniques that can trigger profound psychological material. Stanislav Grof's clinical work with non-ordinary states is a robust example of how breath can catalyze deep experience, but these methods are not casual toys. If you are carrying trauma, cardiovascular issues, epilepsy, or other serious medical conditions, consult skilled professionals before experimenting with intense breathwork. Likewise, if powerful imagery or dysregulated affect arises during practice, seek integration with a therapist, somatic practitioner, or an experienced facilitator. This is not alarmism, it is ethical care. The Hermetic tradition prizes initiation and guidance. The same principle applies here. Powerful practices deserve responsible supervision. Integration begins to reveal itself in the overlap between principles. Consider the pairing of rhythm and vibration. Breath cycles, rhythm, establish the tempo on which vibratory qualities play. Correspondence and mentalism clasp hands when you notice that a stubborn thought pattern has a consistent breath-patternic signature. Change one, and you alter the other. Polarity and rhythm intersect in the ebb and flow of opposites. Expansion and contraction are rhythmic. The Hermetic map gains coherence when you stop thinking of the principles as separate doctrines and start sensing them as interlaced threads of a single fabric. Breath is the loom. And yet there are ethical pitfalls. The seductive part of modern spiritual life is the availability of vivid experience, the possibility of rapid shifts. This can feed the spiritual ego, a pattern the Sufis cautioned against and Jung himself warned to integrate. Experience hoarding, collecting states for the sake of identity, is not transformation. And this is a frustration many people quietly carry but rarely name. They understand the material, they know what should change, and yet nothing inside actually reorganizes, because the work is still happening at the level of understanding, not lived state. If that feels familiar, click the link in the first pinned comment. I left it there for those who are tired of just understanding, and especially tired of pretending they already believe. True change is slower. It is the steady rewiring of habit, the patient facing of shadow, the return to ordinary relationships with more presence and less reactivity. Breath practices that shortcut the process can leave you with unintegrated material, flash experiences without new living patterns. That is why integration must be emphasized as much as exploration. Notice, too, the cultural responsibility embedded in this exploration. Many breath practices come from living traditions, Sufi orders like the Naqshbandi, yogic pranayama lineages, and indigenous wisdoms, each with protocols, ethics, and initiation practices. Readings that synthesize these teachings are interpretive by nature. When we borrow, we must do so with humility, acknowledging lineage and avoiding reductive appropriation. The Hermetic lens is itself a synthesis, not a replacement of these living streams. You may find yourself asking, what is the simple, practical next step? Before any formal technique, there is the single available practice of attention. Notice the breath where you are. Let this be as unassuming as checking the sky. If you are at a computer, take a single, countless moment and place curiosity on the breath. Watch how thought changes its gait when the breath is observed. There is no dramatic promise here. There is instead the quiet fact that attention tends to be redirected, and that redirected attention is the first rudder in the slow work of transformation. We will return to practice more concretely after we complete the map. The remaining three principles, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender, show how habitual cycles entrench destiny, how consequences trace themselves through breath, and how creative polarity is embodied. They also deepen the safety conversation. Rhythm reveals the trap of addiction to certain states. Cause and effect reveals responsibility for small, repeated patterns. Gender, often misunderstood, reframes receptivity and activity as inseparable dance partners rather than moral categories. Before moving on, let me offer an image you can carry into the next section. Picture a reed, hollow, delicate, the source of plaintive song when wind moves through it. The reed's hollow is not absence, it is the condition for resonance. Breath enters that hollow, and depending on its pressure, depth and turbulence, the reed sings differently. The Hermetic principles are, in this image, the shape of the reed, form that shapes resonance. Your breath is the wind. The question is less about acquiring a perfect technique than about attending with curiosity and humility to how the reed is carved and how the wind moves. There is a subtle moral here. Transformation is not primarily about better outcomes. It is about reorientation of allegiance from unconscious reactivity to lived responsiveness. Breathwork, when guided by a hermetic awareness, becomes an apprenticeship in that reorientation. We will pause our map here, having traced the first four principles in depth and sketched their interweavings. Ahead, rhythm awaits, the principle that most obviously locates breath in time, and yet it is also the most treacherous, for rhythm can stabilize both health and habit. Cause and effect will ask us to attend to repeated microactions and their compound influence. Gender will invite a gentle reimagining of creative interplay inside the body, not as doctrine, but as lived dynamics that shape relationship and desire. Rhythm. Rhythm names the law that all things move in cycles, tides, seasons, heartbeats, and the in and out of the chest. It is the law that turns events into habits and habits into character. Seen through a hermetic lens, rhythm explains how small, repeated movements shape the larger arcs of life. Breath is rhythm incarnate. Its pulse hems experience into time. There is a basic truth here. Pattern becomes destiny by repetition. One careful inhale will not remold a lifetime, but 1,000 attended breaths will reweave neural pathways and social habits. The same pulse that synchronizes your diaphragm with your heart also syncs you to others in a conversation, to the timing of a city street, to the slow seasons of grief and joy. In the Sufi image of the reed, the wind's arrival is cyclical, sometimes forceful, sometimes faint, and the reed learns to sing in time with it. Rhythm teaches the reed not only to respond, but to expect. Physiology gives this a sharp edge. Oscillatory phenomena are the language of living systems, neural networks entrained to rhythms, respiratory patterns entrain cardiac rhythms via respiratory sinus arrhythmia. The vagus nerve carries timing-sensitive signals that shape effective regulation. Even at the level of social neuroscience, studies show that people in close interaction tend to align respiration and heart rhythms, a synchronization that underpins empathy and trust. Rhythm is the invisible metronome that coordinates internal and intersubjective life. Read through the principle of rhythm, you begin to see why habitual breath patterns are so powerful. A daily morning tension breath primes the body-mind for vigilance. A habitual slow exhale predisposes you toward steadiness. Rhythms can heal and also consolidate pathology. Addiction to certain states, to high arousal, to dissociation, to performance mode, is in large part a pattern repeated until the nervous system expects it. The Hermetic warning is careful. Rhythm does not judge, it simply repeats. Our ethical work is to place practices into the rhythm so that repetition serves what is wise rather than what is merely habitual. Practically, this reframes the question of practice. Rather than asking which technique will instantly change everything, ask which rhythm you will inhabit over months. If you've already seen this dynamic in yourself, write in the comments, "Rhythm makes destiny." Small rituals, a morning breath check, a brief mid-afternoon pause, a 10-second exhale before a difficult conversation, are not glamorous, but they are where destiny accrues. Consider the medieval alchemist's patience. Repeated work, day after day, alters substances at a microscopic level until the character of matter itself shifts. So it is with breath and the psyche. The Hermetic map asks for steady beats. Choose a practice you can repeat with honesty, not enthusiasm alone. Notice, too, how rhythm moderates the other principles. Rhythm frames vibration. It is the tempo that gives meaning to frequency. Rhythm embeds polarity into time, allowing polar states to alternate and thereby be transformed. Rhythm is the skeleton on which cause and effect hang their garments. Cause and effect. Hermetic cause and effect is simple and relentless. Every action has consequences. Nothing escapes the web of causality. When translated into the language of breath and behavior, this principle insists that small habitual movements have far-reaching outcomes, not metaphysically as mystical boons, but concretely in physiology, psychology, and relation. Breath is a primary actor in a cascade of causes and effects. A pattern of shallow, rapid breath creates micro-states of arousal, shifts in blood gases, altered autonomic tone, tightened musculature, and predisposition toward reactive thought. Those microstates change how you speak, what you notice, how you respond to a partner or a boss, which in turn shapes the social feedback you receive. Over months and years, these microtransactions accumulate into character. A habitual breath of constriction creates a life that looks constricted. Conversely, repeated practices that lengthen the exhale, soften the diaphragm, or invite a spacious pause will tend to produce different social and psychological consequences. From a Jungian vantage, cause and effect also appears in the way repeated avoidance consolidates complexes. Evaded sensations gather in shadowed compartments and return in the form of dreams, compulsions, or somatic symptoms. Breath can be both the tool of avoidance, when one uses rapid breath to outpace feeling, and the instrument of return, when slow attention allows buried material to surface in manageable forms. Stanislav Grof's clinical reports on holotropic breathwork illustrate how intense changes in breathing can generate profound material with downstream effects. Again, these are not endorsements, but reminders of causality's scope. The ethical consequence of embracing cause and effect is responsibility. Hermetic wisdom is uncompromising here. You are not merely moved by invisible forces. You participate in setting them. Small kindnesses, brief moments of attention, a practiced pause before responding, these are causes. In time, their effects compound. Likewise, neglect, hurriedness, and habitual reactivity are causes whose effects can constrict future possibility. Practically, experiment with micro-causes. Before a habitual angry reply, try a single intentional outbreath and observe the cascade. Before bed, choose a rhythm that favors exhalation lengthening and note its effect on sleep. Track, for weeks, a tiny change and watch to whom and how the world responds. This is not mystical. It is a sober acknowledgement that your somatic habits are inputs into a system that returns patterned outputs. And if this cause and effect framing is giving you more responsibility without shame, more precision, less superstition, take a moment to like the video. That feedback tells me you want this channel to keep treating these topics with depth. Gender. The Hermetic principle of gender is often misunderstood if treated as a commentary on anatomy or social roles. Traditionally, it names the presence of active and receptive forces within all things, a creative polarity that animates becoming. Read hermetically gender names dynamism, seed and field, projective impulse and containing form. Breath enacts gender continuously. Inhale gathers seeds and activates. Exhale receives, integrates and grounds. Together, they produce aliveness. This is not a moral claim about how men or women must be. It is an observation about functional qualities present in every psyche and body. At times we need the thrust of inhalation, assertion, planning, projecting. At other times, the receptive exhale, receiving, digesting, listening. When either pole is exaggerated or shamed, distress follows. A culture that prizes constant inhalation, perpetual achievement, ceaseless acquisition, risks flattening the capacity to rest and to receive. A culture that idealizes receptivity without activation can dull initiative. Hermetic gender invites a continual balancing. To cultivate the capacity to give and to receive within a coherent practice. Embodied practice makes this clear. Breath practices that emphasize long, open inhales without equally honoring the exhale can produce agitation. The reverse can dull clarity. The alchemical dictum solve et coagula is again useful. Certain moments require dissolution, softening, receiving. Others, coagulation, focus, born intention. Jung's image of the union of opposites, the conjunctio, is not merely psychological archism. It is a map for cultivating the inner marriage of activity and receptivity. Practically, notice which pole you habitually favor. Do you live in mostly inhalation, initiating, speaking, doing, and then find emptiness in the quiet? Or do you often withdraw into receiving to the point that projects falter? Use the breath as an axis for recalibration. A simple exercise. Before an important project, take breaths that emphasize clear, steady inhales followed by full, stabilizing exhales. Before restorative time, practice breaths that elongate the exhale and allow the chest to soften. The point is not to assign moral value, but to domesticate the dynamics so they serve your life rather than enslave it. Integration. How the principles weave together. The 7 principles are not discrete knobs to be tuned independently. They are threads in a single woven cloth. Mentalism sets the field. Mind and its tone shape the possibility space for breath. Correspondence gives us a map. What happens? Micro mirrors macro. Vibration tells us the quality of the field. Polarity teaches us to read spectrums. Rhythm supplies the tempo. Cause and effect insists on responsibility for repeated inputs. Gender names the play between active and receptive dynamics. Breath is the loom on which this tapestry is made. When these laws operate coherently, life gains a certain coherence. Moods smooth, relationships become more responsive, choices feel less driven by old ghosts. But coherence can also calcify into a new rigidity if misused. Here, the danger lines run through the modern appetite for rapid transformation. Chasing spectacular states without integration, copying techniques without lineage, fetishizing high vibration as a social status. The Hermetic map resists such shortcuts. It emphasizes apprenticeship, iteration, and the slow algebra of habit. Shadow and spiritual ego deserve special attention. Attention to breath can accelerate access to disowned material. The person who has cultivated a luminous presence may feel proud of their attainments. Pride, in turn, is a reactive complex that breath can expose. A breath practice that is not integrated can become a cosmetic, a way to appear present in public while remaining reactive in relational life. The task of transformation is not solely to feel different. It is to act differently, again and again, in ordinary contexts. The Hermetic circle is complete only when new interior patterns result in changed speech, altered relation, and refinements in daily conduct. Ethically, this calls for humility. Many of the practices we borrow come from living spiritual currents, Sufi orders, yogic lineages, indigenous breath traditions, each with embodied ethics and context. Hermetic synthesis can point toward universal patterns, but must not flatten distinct practices into bland techniques. A grateful, cautious humility toward sources is part of the inner work. Safety, limits, and guidance. A clear, compassionate safety note is necessary. Breath practices range from gentle awareness to intense holotropic work that can provoke intense emotional and perceptual material. If you carry trauma, cardiovascular conditions, epilepsy, or psychiatric vulnerability, consult a qualified healthcare provider before engaging in intensive breathwork. If deep imagery, panic, dissociation, or overwhelming affect emerge during practice, stop the technique and seek integration with a psychotherapist, somatic practitioner, or experienced facilitator. Responsible work values pacing, containment, and community. Tradition keepers often speak of initiation for a reason. Potent practices deserve careful support. Also, beware of grand claims. The Hermetic principles offer frameworks for seeing and for remapping, not guarantees. Breathwork is a powerful lever, but not a magic elixir. The promise is subtle, a gradual reorientation of lived attention, the incremental untangling of habit, the cultivation of a steadier presence that changes how life unfolds. That is deep enough and precarious enough to merit humility. A gentle, practical micro-ritual. There is, at the center of these arguments, a simple exercise that is both cautious and instructive. Not a therapy protocol, not a rite of initiation, but a moment of practice you can do now and again to taste the terrain. Wherever you are, permit a small pause. Allow your posture to be supported by whatever you sit or stand on. Let curiosity land on the place where breath moves most noticeably for you. Maybe the rise and fall of the chest, the belly, the throat. Breathe as follows without force or style. Inhale for a count that feels natural but slightly longer than usual. Hold the breath for a moment that feels neutral, not strained. Exhale gently, allowing the shoulders to release. Rest for a breath or two without pushing. Repeat this pattern for 1 to 3 cycles, keeping the quality curious rather than performance-driven. As you do, notice one thing, the qualitative shift in tone. Is the mind less urgent? Does a tightness soften even a few degrees? Name what arises without dramatizing it. Tension, relief, memory. If a strong emotion surfaces, simply note it and let the breath be steady and non-coercive. If anything becomes overwhelming, stop the practice and seek support. This micro-ritual is an invitation, not a test. It offers a miniature mapping of the Hermetic interplay. Inhale, mentalism active, pause, correspondence, threshold, exhale, receptivity, gender, rest, void, rhythm, and the felt vibration in between, integration practices, and the long work. If the single breath is a seed, integration is the garden care. The long work requires a few steady commitments, consistent practice, honest reflection, and relational feedback. Practice without self-inquiry risks ritual without insight. Self-inquiry without practice becomes an idle intellect. Relationship without containment reproduces old patterns. The Hermetic apprenticeship asks for triangulation, a daily somatic habit, reflective journaling or therapy to trace inner movement, and at least one experienced teacher or peer group to provide correction and perspective. Attend also to ordinary life as the arena of integration. Are you kinder after practice? Do your conversations change? Do habitual triggers lose their immediate reactivity? Transformation is known in these small returns. A less automatic response to provocation, a greater capacity to listen, a clearer boundary when necessary. These are the signs the 7 principles are moving from theory into embodied habit. Return to the read. We began with the reed because it is simple and deep. The reed is hollow. It is shaped by the artisan. It sings only when wind moves through it. Over time, the reed's song is determined by subtle sculpting, by the recurrent pressure of breath, by the ambient climate in which it vibrates. So with the self. The Hermetic principles name the shaping forces: mind, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, gender. Breath is the wind that passes through. Together, they form a quiet apprenticeship, not a sudden deliverance, but a sustained reorientation. This is the claim of the title made practical. Why do the 7 ancient Hermetic principles quietly reshape life at its deepest level? Because they are not remote metaphysics, but descriptions of the very patterns that breathe through you. They register in your vagal tone, your neural rhythms, your social exchanges. They are expressed in the way you pause before speaking, the way you habitually tighten in grief, the way you open to joy. When you learn to read breath through the Hermetic lens, you gain not a gimmick, but a map for patient reform, the capacity to notice inputs, to shape small causes, to inhabit steadier rhythms, and to perform the inner alchemy of solvet coagula in daily conduct. As you consider exploring these pathways, do so with respect and humility. Honor the lineages that cultivated breath, the Sufi teachers whose metaphors we borrow, yogic teachers whose pranayama techniques are the result of centuries of practice, Jungian clinicians whose maps of psyche require careful application, and modern clinicians who study autonomic regulation. If you teach or share practices, prioritize safety, informed consent, and integration. The Hermetic promise is not a warrant for cultural appropriation or for shortcutting initiation. It is a call to responsible curiosity. Breathe once more with intention. Inhale as if drawing in a possibility you have not yet named. Pause and feel the tiny space where the world and you meet. Exhale and let your shoulders answer the breath. Carry the reed with you, hollow enough to resonate, shaped enough to sing. The 7 principles have been at work whether you notice them or not. You now have a choice about how to meet them, with curiosity, discipline, and ethical care. And if you stayed until the end, let me know by writing in the comments. The principles shape the pattern. I'm leaving another lesson on your screen right now that extends this inquiry. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.